Thank you for joining us on Nantucket Small Business Update. We have Kristie Ferrantella, President of the Chamber, Meghan Blair-Valero from Fogged in Bookkeeping, and Karen Macomber, who does a million things. She's our entrepreneur, expert, a small business owner, and whatever else I forget, Karen, you can jump in there. We're going to be talking about small business relief, any updates on loans and grants, and we've got three great minds here, very experienced, as much as you can be experienced in these last 5 or 6 weeks. So Karen, do you want to start off on any updates you have on any business relief?
Certainly, there's actually been quite a bit that's been going on since the last time we all got together. I'll start with the EIDL loan, which is one of the first programs that came out. Unfortunately, even with the latest round of funding, that is now closed to new applicants. So if you've not already applied for that, unfortunately, the time's up on that. If you have applied, I've had a lot of questions about kind of what to expect. What we've been seeing here is that you get an initial confirmation after you apply, and then next thing you know, if you checked off that you wanted the advance, it shows up in your bank account without any pre-warning. So I would suggest make sure you keep checking your bank account. And once that does show up, then generally in about another week or two, you'll get another email that'll ask you to create an account in the system. And when you log on at that point, it's going to show you what the maximum is that you can take. You can always adjust it down. And then you'll go ahead and say that you accept it, and then they'll generate the paperwork, and then you sign your life away. and then in theory, they fund the account. And you do have 2 months from the time that they generate that paperwork for you to decide to actually sign and take it. So if you haven't received your PPP, for example, and you're waiting, you can feel free to go ahead and wait a bit and then go ahead and sign the EIDL work.
Thank you, Karen, for going over the EIDL loan, because I just, for the my small coffee shop, I received mine, I think on Friday morning. I didn't see it until Saturday night. And I got no warning. It just went right into my account. So you're saying in weeks I will get some kind of email from the SBA from this program, and then I will be able to see what else they are extending me for a loan. Is that what you're saying?
Correct. You'll go in there and it will actually give you a range. It will say you can take from 0 to whatever X the maximum is, and you go ahead and select one.
Okay. And what are the percentages of those being offered right now?
Oh, I'm sorry. What? Sorry. Go ahead, please. The
percentages. So if I do continue and take a loan out, is it similar to a line of credits that the banks are offering? Is it lower?
Yeah. So that is definitely a loan. It's 3.75 for anybody that's for profit, 2.75 for anyone not for profit. There is a 12-month deferral on that, and you have 30 years to pay it back.
Wow.
Okay. Just like a mortgage.
Time. Okay, great. That's good for me to know, and I hope other people who have gotten the EIDL loan now have a little bit of a roadmap for what to do.
Right. The next up is everybody's favorite PPP, which again received more funding just recently, thankfully. This has to go through a bank. Most banks are participating now. We know that locally, again, Cape Cod 5, Rockland Trust, Bank of America. If you have a banking relationship, or even if you don't, you can start one with them. This is the 2.5 times the average payroll if you are a corporation. There's a whole bunch of rules about how you can establish what that average payroll is, if you're seasonal, if you're not, who you have on your payroll. It can't include your contractors or 1099 folks because they can apply directly themselves. You'll go ahead and submit through the bank. Each bank has its own process. And again, my own personal opinion is I heard relatively quickly back that there was an approval amount, and then they generate some paperwork. The bank does have to fund you within 10 days of when you're approved by the SBA. That one is the one where there is a forgiven piece. It could be actually the entire thing, but there's all kinds of rules. We're still learning a lot of the nuances there, but basically 75% has got to go for your payroll, 25% can go for rent and utilities. You have to keep really, really great records of exactly where that money is going to. It can't be the same as the EIDL money that you're spending. Your EIDL advance is going to be deducted from the amount that you get for the PPP. So in other words, you only get so much of a grant between both of those programs. And it's not just your head count, it's also people's actually payroll level. So not only do you have to kind of go back to the number of folks that you said you had on average, you have to make sure that you're paying them on average about what you were based on your application. The other thing is that as soon as the money is in hand, your 8-week time clock starts. And that's the 8-week period that that cash has to go out to your employees. You have to be able to show that you actually paid them then. You can't wait and pay them 4 weeks from now. And then you will submit back to the bank. The bank is the one that's going to go through it and determine if you actually are forgiven. So they'll follow SBA guidelines, but moral of the story is be really tight with your bankers.
Yeah, and I have some things I would add there too, is that there are actually some non-bank lenders now available in the marketplace. 465,000 plus loans have actually been made through non-bank lenders now. One of the best examples of that are companies like Cabbage with a K and Square, who some people may be familiar. Jason, I know you guys use Square. And so with the PPP lending through them, we're actually seeing really fast response and great results. So if you possibly weren't able to get into a loan process with a community bank, which we've had fabulous results with, and we're looking through an alternative, we're seeing an average response and funding time of under 10 days with Square. So if you were perhaps using, Chase Bank or some of these other banks that prioritize loans based on amount, you were only looking for, 5 or 10,000, and so you got pushed down the list. We've had really good luck sort of going through non-banking lenders for those kind of things. The other piece that I wanted to add is if you've gotten EIDL funds, I wanted to be clear that that actually doesn't decrease your PPP loan funding. It gets combined for the purpose of forgiveness. So you may have gotten EIDL funding and PPP loan funding, and your forgiveness is going to happen on the EIDL first. And so you may end up with some extra funds through PPP that you can either choose to return, or you can keep that loan and use it at the 1% interest rate that's being extended. And the third piece that I did want to clarify with PPP, Karen had said 75% for payroll. You can use a minimum of 75% for payroll under your forgiveness. You could use 100% of it for payroll. That's just not a scenario that happens a lot. But you could use more than 75% for your payroll, and your payroll contributed components like 401k matches and health insurance, et cetera.
What challenges is everybody seeing for the seasonal aspect of Nantucket? I've heard that you get the PPP loan, but you're not open yet, and you've got to start using it. How are people working through the seasonality challenge?
Yeah, we are seeing that, and that is my own personal situation with the inn. We can't open yet, and I have to start using that PPP. So taking some folks off unemployment, just kind of doing the right thing on that front. If there's someone that can function in multiple roles, then trying to get them on board to maybe do something to help out. So for example, just get the inn ready to open instead of actually working with the guests when they're actually here. So I think there's a couple ways going around that. I think one of the challenges is that in some cases I've heard that folks who, when they stay on unemployment, they're actually making more than when they get paid through the PPP. And they are not obligated to go off unemployment just because you offer them something through the PPP.
Well, here in the state of Massachusetts, they are, if you offer them their job back, they are obligated to come off of unemployment. that's the rule with unemployment in the state of Massachusetts. Other states, it isn't that way, but here it is. So the U.S. Treasury came out with the FAQ 40 yesterday, or Friday, I think, some point over the weekend, that did clarify under PPP, if you give a written offer of employment to your employee and they decline, and you have to have both of those things documented, you can include that in your forgiveness and you don't get dinged. So if I offer Jason his job back and he refuses in writing, I may be able to count that within my number of employees for average FTEs and not have my forgiveness dinged because he refused to take his job back. However, in doing that in the state of Massachusetts, there are consequences if the state of Massachusetts then is privy to that information, because under the Department of Unemployment, if I offer a job back to my employee and they refuse it, they are no longer eligible for unemployment benefit. So it's a really double-edged sword for a lot of employers that are trying to help their employees do what's best.
Yeah, and thank you for that clarification. I know it's very tricky and confusing for all of us, honestly.
It literally came out over the weekend. We just were reading about it this morning.
And speaking of forgiveness, Megan, what other types of documentations or things should employers be keeping track of to make sure that they can fully maximize the forgivable portion?
So you definitely need to keep track of the documentation, almost like you're going into an audit of backing up every dollar. So if you're applying for a certain amount of forgiveness, you need documentation that proves that you spent that much money. So things like your payroll reports, maybe keeping a separate little electronic folder or physical folder within your office of that information so you don't have to go back and find it after the fact. Copies of your utility bills, if they're included within your forgiveness, and copies of things like health insurance bills or 401k contributions. All of that documentation you want to make sure you save. And things like rent can be a little bit tricky because you don't necessarily get a bill for that. So copies of the check that you wrote out are going to be important, because the time span in which you write the check is what matters, not when it clears the bank. So you may not want to depend on waiting for that check copy to come back through your bank statement, because that may not validate that you wrote made the payment within the payment period. There's some debate about cash versus accrued basis. Does it matter that I use the electricity or, had the rent happen within this period versus when I'm actually paying for it? That becomes really important with payroll. If you've got a bunch of payroll that happens, the people do the work in the last week of the 8-week period, but payroll doesn't happen until 1 day or 2 days outside of that pay period. What does that mean? And unfortunately, we don't have a lot of guidance yet from the SBA on these forgiveness periods and how that might work. So we're really cautioning our clients to be on the safe side. And if it means you have to run a special payroll within your forgiveness period to make sure that that's documented within your 8-week period, right now we're saying, do that. And it might be a little off schedule or a little funky, but it would be the safest result. I think that's just where we all sort of have to operate right now without additional guidance. But if you want to follow along, ustreasury.gov, and there's a COVID-19 banner right there, and you can click on that and all of the up-to-date information. So every time they release new guidance, it's right there in the forefront as a PDF. We check it every day. I think a business owner, if you check it once a week, you'd be safe. And the new guidance and any new, they call it an FAQ, FAQ report, is there. And I'm sure as soon as the chamber sees something like that, I'm sure they'll be distributing it.
Megan, are those same guidelines for the EIDL loan? So if a little small business like mine gets 10 grand, we have to track on where we're using that money, because they'll be reporting at the end of the year, or end of the tax year.
And Karen might know even more about this than me, but my understanding is the forgiveness on EIDL is limited to that initial tranche that you got at the beginning. And so there are some restrictions on how you use those funds, and that may be audited at some point, but it's not the same level of accountability and the same strict definition of how you're allowed to use those funds as PPP. So yes, there's a record keeping component of it, but it's not nearly as stringent as PPP funding.
Yeah, it certainly has more flexibility in terms of how those funds can be used. So for example, mortgage interest, you can use it for payroll if you want, or again, you may want to separate out and use your PPP for the payroll and use your EIDL for some of the other things, even your marketing, your software, that kind of thing. One of the things that I have been told by accountants, and it makes perfect sense, is that when you do get these loans, you should open up a separate account. So, with that EIDL, go ahead and open up a separate business account, put it in that account. So at least that way you can separate out those funds from your other funds and be able to keep better records.
And I think that really depends on the client, because 100% of our clients were giving the exact opposite advice.
No.
Sometimes an extra account it's another set of checks you have to buy. It's another account to reconcile and keep track of. If your payroll company is already in place, trying to change the account that your funds are drafted from can be cumbersome, if not impossible. And not all of the funds in your payroll are subject to forgiveness. So if you do change that payroll processing over to a new account, then you've got to put money from another account in to sort of balance out the federal taxes that aren't subject to forgiveness. So what we're cautioning people to do is keep it simple. If you can use the same account you've been using, because as little change as possible right now is important to people, especially if you would have to order new checks and wait for those and that sort of thing. But use all of the, market general ledger softwares, whether they be QuickBooks or Xero or FreshBooks and these things, they have the ability to sort of tag transactions with what's called a class or a department. And so we're using those classes and departments. And within QuickBooks Online, you can even make sub-accounts of your bank account to sort of keep a running ledger. So I think even for novice users, there's simpler ways than adding another bank account. But I think what's important is check in with your accounting professionals that you're working with. Check with your bookkeeper, check with your tax accountant, or if you don't have either of those things, which you really, really should, check in with your banker and what your particular bank is recommending, and figure out which is working for you. I would say that there's not a blanket solution for every single business.
So we talked a little bit about how this affects seasonal workers and seasonal employers. What about independent contractors? That's another big portion of the Nantucket economy. And how are they applying, and are you seeing them getting approval and a little bit more information for them?
Yeah, and I'm going to defer to Megan on this one, definitely, because most of my work has been really with the corporations.
We're seeing both multi-member LLCs where an owner or officer maybe isn't able to be on payroll, as well as sole proprietors and single member LLCs, again, where owners and officers are not on a formal payroll receiving loans. Where we are very much in the dark is how the forgiveness on that is going to work, because by the letter of the bill and the way that it was written, the forgiveness would then be determined by profitability. But if you're not open and not generating revenue, it's very difficult to be profitable in this 8-week period. So we are really, those are the folks that are depending most on this updated information from the SBA on how this will be forgiven and how it will be forgivable. Those folks that we've seen receive PPP loans, more likely than not, were on PUA, which is the independent contractor version of unemployment, prior to receiving the loan. And some of them are making some determinations of, do I stay on PUA or do I take the PPP loan? What's best for my business? And what's really important is that because your neighbors, brothers, friends said, well, this is what's best, that may not be best for you. You really need to check in with whoever your advisory team is, and with yourself. And if that means doing a little back of the envelope math on which one's better, or putting together like a quick little spreadsheet, you should do that. And you do need to keep in mind that PUA funds are taxable. It's taxable income for you. And PPP funds are non-taxable. So even if I got $10,000 from PUA and $10,000 from PPP, those mean different things to me at the end of the day, depending on the tax bracket that I'm in. So you need to sort of look at your own individual situation. The other thing to keep in mind is you can come off of PUA for the 8-week period of your PPP loan period and go back on unemployment if you're still not able to go back to work. So accepting PPP funds for your business as a sole proprietor or independent contractor does not mean you're going off of that unemployment benefit forever. You can go back on if you have not exceeded your your number of weeks that you're limited to. So keep that in mind, that you can sort of use both tools. You just can't use them at the same time.
Thank you. I think that's really helpful for all of our independent contractors on the island.
Yeah, I'm taking a lot of notes here, in here, and I'm actually writing stuff down. So this is very helpful for me. What else? So we went over PPP, went over the EIDL loans. Is there anything in unemployment we need to understand? Are there some misconceptions out there? Are employers trying to figure out, let me ask you this, are employers struggling with trying to get their people to come back and they're kind of stuck because they're making decent money with this extra federal, unemployment check? It's probably called something different than that. Are we seeing any challenges there?
To your point there, it is challenging when someone's going to be making more money through that than they would, unfortunately, through what you could offer them at this point. So, yeah, that's really been challenging. Megan, I'm not sure what you've seen.
100%. Like, it's a tough thing. I think the people that we're seeing have the best success getting people to come back to work are having one-to-one conversations with their employees about the long game, about beyond the week to week. If I'm able to get this PPP loan and I can retain you as an employee, we have a shot at a season. If nobody wants to come back to work and I can't get this loan, which then also helps with health insurance and rent and everything else, we don't come back to work, there is no job. So I think those kind of conversations have been helpful, and most people get their head around, the long-term reciprocity of the situation, that, sort of looking beyond this week. I think there's people that understandably can't. They're in a situation where it is week to week for them. But most people are understanding the long game. And I think it's just hard because there's a lot of unknowns. We don't know. We know we will reopen. We don't know when or what that necessarily looks like yet. And then, the DUA experience is a special one. And I think, for people that fall in a seasonal employers or are using that independent contractor version of unemployment, it can be a sticky thing for folks to navigate. The one upside, though, as seasonal employers who are weighted towards a summer season, is seasonal employment, in the way the law was originally defined, did not really acknowledge that seasonality is different in different regions. It was really geared towards like Florida, where you have a Florida representative that's largely responsible for drafting the legislation. That's not a surprise. But it sort of left us out. So in the last 2 weeks, they've come back with new guidance about how you can do your look back periods. And what came of that is you have a choice. And for most small businesses now, here in Nantucket, where you have a summer seasonality, you have this option of picking this period where your FTE number is going to be really low. And so meeting that number becomes much easier. For a lot of my employers, like seasonal restaurants and that kind of thing, you might be looking at a number like 4 or 5 instead of 50. And so being able to get back up to your FTE number which is your full-time equivalent number of employees, gets much easier. And then you don't have to hire back 50 employees. You have to hire back 5. So that, you know, you have to play with the numbers a little bit, but that in some ways really helped us as an island.
Although I will say it's been challenging too, because a number of us have employees who are not even back physically on island, if not back in the country in some cases, to be able to even start their employment in any form or fashion. I think the one good thing is that at least with the PPP, you have to hit the head count to a certain extent, and you have to hit the payroll, the amount to a certain extent. It doesn't have to be the same exact employee that you're bringing back, though. So there's a little bit of wiggle room in terms of that if you did have to have some employee turnover when some other folks actually did get back in the country.
Right. And when you filled out that application, we should have been excluding non-resident employees anyways, which should have naturally lowered your count and your requirement. It lowered your total loan amount that you were available to get, but it should have generally worked out in your favor.
Unless she was going to get married to someone in Morocco, yes. You know, one thing I think we should talk about too for 2 seconds is just there is one more loan program coming out. We still are waiting for a lot of information. Again, Megan, jump in if you've had more information, but the Main Street loan program was announced. That is something that's coming through the Federal Reserve. So the Reserve is enabling banks to lend to small businesses with a certain level of guarantee behind that. It is supposed to be rates that are lower than normal bank rates. We don't know exactly what that means quite yet. Originally, when they came out, they were asking for a minimum loan amount of $1 million, which meant that it was going to be hard for most of our businesses to really make this work for them. They have taken that down to $500,000 now. So especially for those perhaps that maybe own real estate, they have large mortgage payments, some other things like that, this now could become another program for them. Again, to the extent I know, this will be a loan. This will not necessarily be a forgiven or grant program.
So I think the Handlebar has just applied for that 500,000. We're going to expand and open up 20 stores. And
yeah.
So that one at all yet. So I've been so focused on the PPP and the EIDL loan.
Right.
So real estate, who would that help on Nantucket for small businesses?
Well, I'd say anybody who actually owns the facility where they have their business. In some cases, it is restaurateurs, it's inn operators and hoteliers. I think some retail folks are probably involved in that as well. You know, there may also even be some operators, tour operators or some other folks like that if they happen to have large expenditures. Okay. You know, depending on what the rate is, it might become a attractive alternative to some of these others, especially if you took out, let's say, the EIDL loan, and then we find out that this one is actually, you know, a lower cost in terms of the interest rate.
So if somebody,
that's as much as I can tell you.
So if somebody missed the opportunity to apply for the EIDL and maybe they're not interested in the PPP, this might be a good option for people who maybe have higher rent or mortgages. Is that what you're suggesting?
I'm suggesting that if someone feels that $500,000 or more would be an appropriate loan amount, that this is the program that would be more appropriate for them. It's certainly scaled much more to mid-size and larger companies, but we can make it work at that $500,000, I think.
What are the PPP and EIDL loans capped at? What are the max for those?
Just trying to think off the top, trying to remember. Was it PPP like 2 million?
2 million and 10 million, I think.
And 10 million, okay.
All right.
Yeah, but neither of those have a minimum, whereas this new one will have that minimum.
Okay.
Yeah, the other funding sources and things that we're finding that are really helpful is there's some industry specific organizations that are rallying. So, you know, I don't know, you know, necessarily what has happened, you know, in a lot of detail for, I don't know, painting companies or that kind of thing, because that's not the clientele I service. We focus a lot on hospitality. So I know like within the restaurant world, there are a lot of organizations that have formed because of COVID and really the awkward situation that a lot of hospitality businesses are in. So the Independent Restaurant Association has really come together very quickly and been a strong lobbying power. And they share a lot of good information on their website, but their information tends to be very lobby specific. So we put together a website called 86coronavirus.com, and we try to share as many of these independent funding sources. So sometimes there's funding that might be specific to people that have worked in the service industry for emergency funding for food and rent. There's other funding that's available to restaurants for short-term float loans or grants. And so we try to update as much of that stuff as we can, from a variety of sources. And I think within each industry, there are some of these little subsects. The dollars are much smaller. So you might be able to go to PPP and get tens of thousands of dollars, and everything else is sort of, $2,000 to $5,000 at a time. But if all you need is $2,000 to $5,000, or you have employees that just are really struggling, sometimes these resources can be really helpful. And because they're so micro specific, it's things that, the chamber does not have time to face 20,000 different independent funding sources. So I think, look within your industry for these things because they are popping up and are helpful.
One other thing I'd like to mention, which is not loan specific, but more in relation to insurance and business interruption insurance. I would suggest that everybody do contact your insurance agent if you've not already. We do know that based on current language in most of our policies, business interruption is defined by a physical issue on your property or something that would prevent you from operating. This obviously should be business interruption for all of us. And there are a number of folks that are lobbying to try and get the insurance agencies and companies to cover this in some way, but you need to at least make sure that you have your claim put in. So, we may not get anything out of it, but we still would recommend that you go ahead and put a claim in now.
Well, that'll be interesting, Karen, how that ends up panning out. Somewhere like my coffee shop, I could have stayed open the whole time. I was an essential service in Massachusetts. I decided to close for 6 weeks because my staff didn't feel comfortable working. I didn't feel comfortable being open because I didn't understand the protocols and how I could do it safely. So I probably wouldn't, the state didn't close me down, so I'll have less of a kind of a reason to ask for that insurance. But it'll be interesting to see all those different aspects and different businesses if they're, eligible for that type of insurance. So I guess time will tell.
Yeah, and as Megan said, there are some big players in DC that are lobbying for this right now, especially in the hospitality and travel space.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so even if you made the choice to close, Jason, it may still apply to you because they're making the case that this is a biological contamination issue, and that while the state may not have had the authority and or ability to close your specific location, if you felt that there was a contamination threat, you as the business owner have to ultimately make that choice, same as you would choose to close if there was a gas leak or an unsafe, sanitation condition. So I'm sure our brokers don't love this, but, some of the larger insurance brokerages like Eastern Insurance have come out and said, put the claim in and let the details shake out later, but see what happens. Because I really think, the relief that has happened for some of our small businesses it doesn't fit for everybody. And so, it's going to be a little bit of this and a little bit of that, maybe for some people to get through.
Yeah, speaking of other little ways to help businesses, Karen, do you have any suggestions on kind of talking to landlords or discussing rent?
Certainly. So I think we have to realize that there are two sides in this equation, one being the landlord and one being the tenant. If it's a situation where it's fair for the tenant to go to the landlord, explain a situation, show that there is a real financial hardship, which means opening up your books to a certain extent to make sure they know that this is for real. It's absolutely appropriate to go and ask at a minimum for a deferment. So that being that you just would end up paying the same amount for your total lease, just paying those payments a bit later. In some cases, some landlords may be able to offer an abatement, which would actually be taking a certain amount off. I've heard different scenarios across the island right now in terms of different landlords doing different things. The one thing I would just say is, in fairness to those landlords, in some cases, I mean, that the rent coming in is their income and their way of life. And their business. So I don't think people should automatically assume that just because they can't open, their landlord should just start giving them all kinds of, offer them different ways of saving money. But it's worth a discussion at the very least. I would also just make sure you try and document those discussions to the extent you can. So that you can go back to that later on if there is any question or disagreement about what you agreed to.
I agree with everything. I've been having those conversations on both sides as a tenant and a landlord, and I find it very helpful, as difficult as a conversation as it might be between the two parties, is to get as much numbers as you can, right? Your cash flow projections, if you think you're going to be 50% down, the money you have now, looking at last year, and like really talk about it. And from a tenant standpoint, I went in looking from the perspective of if I don't get some kind of help, whatever that means, we can work on it. And I'm down 50% this summer. I don't know if I'll be able to be open in the winter, and I might have to close down. And that's 100% not a threat, but here's my reality. What do you think? And then I'll hear it from the other side, and then I happen to play the landlord side the next week. And so very interesting, but the communication and talking is really important.
Very true.
For our clients, we've been doing a spreadsheet based on our prior year's known. So your fixed costs are your fixed costs, right? My insurance doesn't get cheaper because I'm closed in most cases. A lot of my pricing is fixed. My health insurance isn't cheaper. But there's things that do change based on, opening and closing. And we've made these dynamic spreadsheets where there's basically a slide rule for clients. And they can say, well, what does it look like at 80%? What does it look like at 20%? And they can move it back and forth to facilitate these landlord conversations to say, if I'm confined to 30% capacity or, a 70% drop in my, retail revenue or whatever that is, what does that look like for both of us from a sustainability model? And I think, landlords are it would be hard to find another tenant right now. Mm-hmm. Not impossible, but difficult. And so I think those sort of open conversations about what's in the best interest for everybody can be really powerful, but you have to go in with more than, well, I can't pay you.
Yep.
And one of the, in attending actually a webinar for the Real Estate Association, just to kind of learn more from their side of things here. I know people have asked me, should we go in as a whole group together behind one landlord or not? The recommendation that was given through them was that it really should not be as a group, that each lease can be very, very different. Each business is very, very different, cash needs, cash flow. That it should be a one-on-one conversation between landlord and tenant based on your own unique situation versus just trying to get a whole group and go after them.
The individual abatement or deferment conversations will be individual, but I think what we will see is when there are more knowns and when we've sort of cleared the other side of this, there will likely then be the time for group conversations about revaluing leases and what does this mean in the longer term.
Great advice. Well, as we wrap up here at the end, anything that we missed, anything that we need to just brush over really quick for our small businesses out there?
Well, I think just what what's been mentioned by you and Megan, which is it's time to be sitting in front of those spreadsheets right now. As much as I know most of us, that's not our favorite part of running the business, but running the different scenarios, because we really don't know what kind of summer we're going to have here. We don't know exactly the date that we can reopen. Or what that's going to mean for the business. So we have to have a really solid feel for exactly what our cash flow is going to be, and not just for the next couple of months. I mean, this really should be projected out, over the next year, so that you just have you have some comfort level in knowing that you will be able to pay your bills until hopefully things really do start to get back to normal.
Yeah, we're saying hang in there a lot. Think innovatively. The old model doesn't apply anymore. And so you've got to really stop saying, well, this is how we've done it, because how we've done it is not necessarily going to work. We're seeing a lot of Nantucket businesses be really creative and smart about how they're doing it. And, finding the right tools to make it happen. And a little bit think and live like a shark. Do not stop moving.
Megan, I'll jump in with a quote to summarize what you just said: is yesterday's home run does not help today's game. I mentioned this on a talk last week that, I've had this business for 6 years. The first 2 years I was pretty innovative. I adapted a lot. In the last 4 years, I've just been really lucky. People keep coming through the door, and I have not had that entrepreneurial kind of invent this mindset, and I have to now. Right? I got to act like a startup and have big ideas. And because a lot of us are small on this island, we can move quickly, right? We're not too big to not be able to reinvent the model or have to go through this slow board process, right? We can change on a dime. So that's what I've been trying to tell everybody, is just think like a startup again, which is hard to do if you haven't done that in a while.
And there's good thinking partners here, whether they're Karen or other people at the chamber. Jason, you're always good for me to bounce ideas off of. Like, find your community. You don't have to innovate alone or in your own silo. Lots of people, cross-pollination across industries and problem solving is good.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and we should definitely give a shout out to WACK-FM. We started this new radio series called Keep the Rock Solid, The Road to Recovery. Melissa Murphy each week is interviewing 3 different entrepreneurs here on island who are doing some really, really innovative things to make sure that their businesses do stay solid, that the economy stays solid here. So those are posted as podcasts. You can find a link on keeptherocksolid.com and also True Island Digital.
Great. Any last words for you, Kristie?
Yeah, I was just going to say, we're all trying to reinvent the new normal, and it's been really inspiring to see all these businesses come up with new creative ideas. And, you're still selling the same product, but you're maybe changing the way that you're selling it or creating all new products. And it's just been really inspiring to hear those stories. And it's been interesting to see how the chamber can help kind of promote that cross-pollination. This week, we're going to be doing a lot of industry calls with the town of Nantucket, and it'll be interesting to see what comes from those discussions.
All right. Think about why you do what you do, not what you do, right? And adapt. Well, thank you all for all this great advice. We learned about PPP loans and EIDL, and we even learned about the FTE meant. And I was going to ask that question, Megan. And Main Street program, Keep the Rock Solid. A lot of great advice here. I hope this gets out. People watch it. Thank you, NCTV 18, for doing everything for this community and helping all of us get the word out in many different aspects. So thank you all again, and we'll see some of you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.